Welcome to the Trad Dads podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought.
All right, so today I am going to be sharing with you a lecture that I gave online to the Canis Society a couple of months ago. And so you're going to be hearing my lecture on that and maybe a couple of questions that I answered at the end. Sorry for the delay in the episode this week. I've just been busy with a bunch of other stuff. But I did want to get something out for you. So here it is. Enjoy.
I've been thinking about what Catholic economics should sound like or should look like. And sort of, should I be modifying my sort of libertarian, liberal outlook to some extent? And what can an economist bring to the table in terms of helping people understand, the social encyclicals and other issues like usury and stuff like that? And what I want to do is just sort of go through a few policy proposals and things like that, but I want to start off talking about what I think the problem is in terms of general economics and our understanding of it as traditional Christians or whatever you want to call that. So I would say that economists separate moral and ethical questions from the sort of purely technical questions of economics. And so, in economics, we call this the normative versus positive distinction. And of course, that's all fine when you're talking about abstract theory. But when you start applying that to policy and things like that, obviously things get a little bit blurry. And of course, there are attempts to avoid this blurriness, but I just don't. I think there are problems when you start out with this separation, which is why I really like the idea of kind of coming back and trying to tie in some kind of explicit moral and ethical foundation to economics. And I know there have certainly been attempts at this type of thing in books previously, but I think one of the problems we have is that they're often not written by economists or trained economists. And so, even though that probably shouldn't matter if the person knows enough about economics, when you're trying to convince other people to come to your position, sometimes credentials matter. So when someone tries to take a more integrated approach, the typical response from, I would say, the bulk of the economics profession is to say that, well, you're blurring the normative positive distinction, and in more raucous types of discussions, you hear sort of a lot of name calling, socialist, fascist, or worse things when you start trying to implement an explicit moral foundation that is not that did not come from John Stuart Mill. So, excuse me, I'm sorry. So the reality is that even though I think a lot of times we hear denials of this, there certainly are underlying moral and ethical assumptions to the economic theory that we all hear and we all read. And those of you who have a chance to look at this stuff probably are well aware of this sort of thing. And so the question is, how should we tie these normative and positive things together as someone who's studying studying economics from a sort of traditional Christian perspective? And I'm going to be explicitly Catholic about it just because that's my bent. But I'm just going to say traditional Christians. I think there should be a lot of overlap between Catholics and other Christians on this sort of thing. So how should we analyze economic policy? How should we set up these moral foundations, and how do those moral foundations affect the economic analysis itself, sort of separated from those moral questions? And then what kind of policies should we embrace? And of course, this is going to depend a lot on the moral component, the ethical component, but it's also going to depend on sort of economic efficiency and things like that. And so again, I'm going to start with sort of Catholic social teaching. If you're not familiar with that, look up things like Rerum Novarum, and maybe I'll get some things over to the manager of the channel, some links to some of this stuff. So Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno, I think, are probably two very good reads to start with. Vix Pervenit on usury is another good read. And there are some later encyclicals from John Paul II and some others that I'll include as well. And just as a side note here, so I am not a distributist. I don't call myself that. I don't think I ever really have. I've never read any of Chesterton's economic stuff ever. I read Hilary Belloc's The Servile State, but I think not to insult Dave Distributist or anything, but I just don't. I think those guys made arguments that were sensible in their time, and I think they were responding to a certain group of people, mostly communists, and I think that's just not where we're at, and not what not the sort of thing we need to be talking about. We have a different set of issues to deal with, a different set of policies, and a different set of folks that are opposing our ideas. And so if you do want to see sort of what I have to say about some of this stuff, you can check out my website. And that was on the first slide there. It's just traddads.com. It's a little cheesy, but we have a podcast that you can look on there. I have several articles, and I'm sort of working on an article series just centered around Catholic economics. So you can check out some more stuff there, and I'll put a link in the description as well if they allow me. So in my framework that I'm putting together on the Trad Dads page under sort of Catholic economic policy, I think there's kind of three components that we have to look at that kind of frame this in sort of a Christian, or I guess more explicitly Catholic social teaching perspective. And so if you read Rerum Novarum, it's an encyclical about labor and labor relations and capitalism and things like that. And of course, there's lots of condemnations of socialism of every form in there, and especially in Quadragesimo Anno. But the thing about it that's very interesting, a friend pointed this out to me, is that the encyclical really starts off talking about the family as the fundamental unit of society. And so I think the way this runs afoul of most economic analysis is really predicated on the individual as the fundamental unit of society and or at the very least the fundamental unit of economic choice. And I think there are probably ways to modify the normative components. In other words, the policy conclusions, even if we leave the individual as the fundamental unit of the economic analysis itself, sort of in a theoretical or in a theoretical sense. But when we get to actually analyzing policy effects and things like that, I think we have to take into account sort of the set of duties and responsibilities that make up a family or an extended family, and think about them more that way. So that's sort of the basis. And then the second point is subsidiarity. And I think this gets more to sort of the political realm. And I think there's some good things in economics about the political realm and how people operate when they work in the political world, whether they're politicians, they're sort of kingmakers, they're sort of political commentators in the media, they're bureaucrats. They are responding to incentives in much the same way that the rest of us do when we are, buying things and providing for our families and things like that. And so we need to recognize that. And when we're looking at the sort of political institutions that we live under, I think it's smart to use the public choice school and their work to inform our analysis of economic policy. But in terms of the normative side, in terms of what we think we should be doing in terms of policy, so when we decide whether some political unit should take on a given area of economic policy, we need to keep subsidiarity in mind. And our current Pope, Pope Francis, every time he says subsidiarity, he seems to say solidarity right after it, as if to sort of downplay subsidiarity. But certainly subsidiarity is a very important part of the church, and all it simply means is that the smallest or lowest level political unit should be allowed to handle policy that it is competent to handle. So, in other words, if something can be handled by the family itself, in other words, potentially, at least in, we would think in normal times, maybe the provision of food, right? So, for the children, right? So that should normally be handled by the family. That should not be handled by some larger political unit where there's some sort of collective ownership. Catholic social teaching is very serious about private ownership of the means of production, and not merely in a sort of legal title sense, but in terms of control and things like that. And then the point is that you have a set of duties incumbent on you as a Christian to operate properly with your ownership of those assets. So I think the Catholic Church's position is, generally speaking, to prefer those lower political units, except when they're not competent. So when we think of things like self-defense of the nation, right, a national defense, well, obviously that cannot be necessarily handled and coordinated well by counties or maybe even states, and so it should be moved up the ladder to a higher level of analysis, or to a higher level of responsibility. And so finally, the third one there, efficiency. And so I think this just really comes down to where economics as a discipline contributes. So the first two are, the first one is obviously sort of the moral foundation. The second one is the political foundation. And the third one is economics contribution to the determination of good policy. And so the idea is that, we just want to do cost-benefit analysis correctly in light of the previous two. So in light of the fact that the family is the fundamental unit of society, in light of the fact that we prefer lower political units, and we prefer, a greater leeway on property rights over more restrictions on it, generally speaking, then we need to, when we actually look at a policy, we need to keep those things in mind when we do our cost-benefit analysis from an economic standpoint. So on to family. Again, this is probably a repeat of some of this, but fundamental unit of society, that is the family, certainly not the individual. Communities do support families, and communities themselves rely on commerce. So as anyone can attest who has a nice, a good support system, and in my own experience, this is why we moved 950 miles halfway across the country back home, was to sort of be part of our family support group, and to be part of a community of people that we felt like we knew better, and things like that. And so that, whenever a family has a hard time, if a parent loses a job or a child is sick or something like that, we rely on our community, and rightly so. But the community itself is certainly dependent on the commerce that happens around it. And so I think in terms of one of the most obvious sort of policy conclusions we get from looking at things through the lens of the family as the basic unit of society, that really contravenes the typical, economic analysis that you would hear, is that local commerce should be preferred and potentially subsidized, I think. I debated another professor on my campus here a while back, talking about sort of the preference for local commerce and local trade, and is there some reason why we shouldn't just treat trade across state boundaries or across county borders or between towns the same way we treat it between two countries, or between Farmer John and Dave the hardware salesman. The reality is that, and I think this rests on two things. One, the variability of income, so the risk to you. So in other words, you rely on your community. Well, your community's not going to be there if you don't support it with your business, if you aren't buying and selling from members of your community. And of course, not all the time. Obviously, if it's not some kind of authoritarian mandate. But the point is that there should be some preference for that, because when things go wrong, your community is going to be more tightly knit and things like that, because you are, you have these bonds that come from commerce and potentially subsidized. So, I mean, I think sort of the obvious way we subsidize local commerce is things like tariffs. And of course, again, the economics profession is very famous for its denouncing of tariffs and things like that. But again, that might give us the highest average income across all individuals, but it certainly doesn't account for an inequality-based issue, and it does not account for variability. It does not account for sort of the losses of the losses to sort of technological things, it's advanced technology, and the way that sort of displaces people. And of course, there's lots of discussion of that. J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, a recent documentary by the American Enterprise Institute called The Pursuit. Should check that out for that sort of thing. So next, a little bit more of a discussion of subsidiarity. So I've already gone through this first definition here, but at least you have it if you need it. And I'll try to put a link to the slides so that if you want those, you can always get them. So Catholic social teaching does mandate private property, and it is not socialist in any sense of the word. I know there was a recent stream by a pretty well-known duo in the sort of traditional Catholic space, sort of about an hour and a half long, denouncing of distributists as socialists and blah, 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 this sort of thing. And the first episode of the Trad Dads podcast actually tackles this, and I think we did a pretty good job responding to them. But there is a mandate in Catholic social teaching for private property, and the excesses of capitalism are condemned, but socialism is inherently condemned in and of itself. So I think here where we can sort of think about some issues with subsidiarity and practical policy would be sort of the connection between big business and big government. I think this comes out really well in Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. He talks about this connection between large firms and big government, and how large firms can sort of feed the beast, through things like lobbying, right? And so again, this is where we can sort of rely on the public choice school of economics to understand lobbying and sort of the supply of the supply of favorable policy from the politicians and the demand for it from businesses and other interests. Not that those interests don't, those interests aren't always nefarious, but sometimes they are. And so if we're going to sort of build subsidiarity into things, talking about how we get from A to B is very, very, very difficult. But one of the things that I've noticed in looking at just observing the way policy works is that when you devolve power to lower levels, and it just sort of creates uncertainty for these large firms. So if you have a business that operates over 5 political units, and each of those 5 political units are differ on the policies that relate well to this business. So here's a good example. When the whole mandatory labeling of GMOs thing came up, there was some success at the state level up in the Northeast at passing regulations that would require these very large food companies to label, to put GMO labels on their food. And so if you think about that, so now put yourself in the place of Campbell's or, one of these big food companies. Well, now you have to create different labels for Vermont or whatever it is. You have to create one set of labels for Vermont and one set of labels for everybody else. Well, if Vermont was, Texas and had 29 million people in it, that might not be a big deal. But when it's Vermont and it has, 3 or 4 million people in it, or however big Vermont is, that's all of a sudden becomes a problem, a serious problem. And so what we saw happen was this sort of, there were a lot more threats from other states and then Pacific Northwest and other states in the Northeast that were going to pass different versions of these GMO laws. And what we saw was that the food companies lobbied the federal government to sort of pass a preemptive law that would just create a compromise between the food company and some of these states with, a lot of sort of active discussion of the GMO question, and just sort of mandate the whole thing for the whole country. And so then these smaller political units don't get to make a decision. And I would argue that, labeling whether food should have or deciding whether GMO food should have a label on it or not, is certainly not a federal decision. And so you can see where there is this tension between big business and big government. Now, of course, bigger businesses can buy off smaller political units. Of course they can. But the thing is, smaller political units are more, beholden to the people underneath them. And so there's certainly, that's where I would push back. Yes, of course, a big business can buy off, a state or a county, a state or a county's policies, but the voters in those smaller political units notice a lot more, and it's a lot easier to sort of activate and oppose that sort of thing. I mean, just look at Ocasio-Cortez pushing Amazon out of New York City recently. It's these smaller political units are more responsive. And then I would say at the end here, at the end of this slide anyway, politics and culture influence each other. I know if you listen to Ben Shapiro and some of that crowd that was very attached to Andrew Breitbart's philosophy, he always says, politics is downstream from culture. But the reality is that it's not that simple. There is a feedback mechanism. And, the simplest way to say this is that if something is illegal, that creates some kind of a taboo that affects the culture. People just, when something's illegal, they tend to avoid it more because they just see it as wrong or bad. Now, should they necessarily see it that way? No. Of course, as St. Thomas told us, an unjust law is no law at all. But the political units can have an effect on the culture by their choice of policy. So let's see. Moving on. So efficiency. So I'm just here. All I'm saying is just standard welfare economics. Kaldor-Hicks efficiency, Pareto efficiency, pick your poison. But some kind of cost-benefit test that we can use. Now, are those the best tools always? Not necessarily. And they certainly have very big imperfections. Just because someone could conceptually be compensated for some loss by the party that gains doesn't mean they will be. So it's all very theoretical, and it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about reality. And I think the thing is here that the easiest thing to talk about is sort of this idea of technical progress. And you can tell even just in the name, technical progress. You're automatically supposed to believe that it's good. We have new technology. That must mean we're all better off. Well, that may not be the case. For instance, some technical progress makes it easier to kill babies in the womb. So that's certainly not good. Some technical progress has given governments the ability to surveil and control populations to levels that they would have never dreamed of even 100 years ago. So again, that's a trade-off. It's not obvious that just because you have to think a little bit less in your life and things are a little bit easier to do doesn't mean that it's worth the problem you get from that. And so the way I talk about this is I put it in terms of Harold Demsett's nirvana fallacy. So I'm a huge fan of Harold Demsett's and the idea of the nirvana fallacy, which basically says if you're comparing the actually existing market arrangement versus some policy that you might use to fix some situation, an externality or something like that, you shouldn't treat the policy alternative as if it were some kind of platonic ideal. Just because you can draw the curves on a chalkboard and say, well, if we just put this tax in there, then that fixes the externality, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, there are going to be all kinds of implementation problems with that tax. So the nirvana fallacies would be the idea that you can compare this perfect policy alternative to actually existing markets that are never going to match that state of nirvana that you're putting over on the other example in terms of policy. So I take that perfectly fine. Yes, agreed. But I think the opposite of that is also a problem. There's a couple of the articles on In Defense of Tucker Carlson Part 2, I think, on the Trad Dads page, gets into this sort of nirvana fallacy thing, and then my rejoinder to the Mercatus folks on this issue talks about reverse nirvana fallacy. But what I mean by the reverse nirvana fallacy is just simply this. Just some policy will not perfectly fix the real world problem you see, just because the policy has potential imperfections or could possibly turn out not to fix the issues that you want it to fix, doesn't mean that you shouldn't implement it anyway. Again, I think a lot of this comes down to sort of thinking in averages or thinking in expected values into the future, and not thinking about variance or variability and uncertainty as well. Read Frank Knight on uncertainty. So there's a lot of human judgment that comes into this sort of thing, and that's why some people would argue a sort of more aristocratic form of government might be a little bit better. It's just because you have these sorts of things. You have possibly a chance at some better judgment. So I just want to tackle a few policy things, and then I will wrap up and take any questions. So the first one is the idea of tariffs at the national level. And the first thing, that I would say is that in the economics profession, the concept of a nation is just simply, a map with lines drawn around it, and everybody who lives inside that line is that is the nation. It's just it's a collection of individuals. It's not an entity unto itself that is greater than the sum of its parts. But I think it is. I think just because economics cannot conceive of it that way doesn't mean that most people don't, and most people do conceive of it that way. They do conceive of the United States of America or Canada or Mexico or whatever as something beyond simply all of the individuals who make up that area. There's a collective identity there. And so what that means is that entity has a right to act on behalf of the citizens. So sort of like, put very simply, the way a corporation acts on behalf of the shareholders. So this makes perfect sense, and any sort of Kantian synthetic a priori from Ludwig von Mises or somebody like that is just irrelevant. And I have this link in here. I don't even know why I did this, but there's a great lecture by Edward Feser, and again, this is something I'll put down in the description box if they let me. But Ed Feser has a great lecture he gave to the Mises Institute in the early 2000s, where he discusses the idea that governments have rights. And the Bible's very clear on this, and you can do all kinds of gymnastics to get around that idea, but governments have rights that are independent of the individuals in that live under that government. And so there's a justification biblically and sort of ethically and morally for the state to act on behalf of its citizens in terms of tariffs. So, of course, if you've taken an intermediate microeconomics course or something like that, you've done the math and you've seen how, a tariff reduces overall per capita GDP. So, the average income per person in a country is just simply reduced because you've, quote unquote, artificially reduced the amount of goods coming into the country, and it harms competition and blah blah blah, this sort of thing, creates deadweight loss and all that. But I think the thing is, if we frame this correctly in terms of the nation being an entity that's greater than the sum of its parts, and that the nation is morally obligated to act on behalf of its citizens, then there's a sense in which a tariff that blocks the negative effects of creative destruction. So creative destruction being a term that says basically, this is what competition gets us. It pushes out the firms that are inefficient, and it keeps only the firms that are efficient, right? So if you don't act to as a business person, if you don't act to follow the trends of your market, then you will surely fail. But of course, the dark side of that is unpredictable job loss. In other words, variation at the individual level. In that documentary I mentioned, The Pursuit, there's a very interesting story about a family in Appalachia, and the father is in his 50s. And he's out of a job because of foreign competition or automation or something like that. And so he's despairing because there is just simply nothing he can do to retrain. He can't. What's he going to do? Go to college? I mean, he's 55 years old, and he lives in a trailer house in the hills of West Virginia. How is he supposed to retrain? And so he's not alone, that's for sure. So there is the dark side of creative destruction there. And so perhaps tariffs on certain goods that have certain, that protect certain industries or certain types of jobs or then potentially are justifiable. And just because it reduces overall per capita GDP does not mean it's necessarily bad. And the other way to go, of course, is to think about quotas or things called tariff rate quotas, two-part tariffs. There are certainly a lot of different types of tools that are kind of, conditional or, have different breakpoints and things like that as well that are still relatively simple. But so they disrupt international commerce. So what? And so finally here, political uncertainty leads to economic uncertainty. Just the thing here, you're never in a so-called free trade discussion. You are never going to maintain all of your sovereignty when you are negotiating to remove tariffs, because just as a fact of political economy, the firms that have captured the government on the other side of the equation are going to get regulations imposed. And I mean, we see all kinds of examples of this. In my former career as an extension economist for the Agricultural Extension Service, I would talk to farmers about this sort of thing. We had talked about the Trump not signing the TPP. I can't remember, Trans-Pacific Partnership. There we go. Trump didn't sign that, and a lot of farmers were mad because, they own cattle, and there were going to be a lot of markets for U.S. beef across the Pacific. But, the thing I told him was, it's not just the price of your beef, folks. Like, there was an agreement in there to make the Millennium Copyright Act punishable as a criminal offense. So, in other words, if these farmers got into their tractors and started messing with the software, they could be put in jail for it, instead of just being sued by John Deere or whatever. So, this is serious political uncertainty that comes from these so-called free trade discussions, and they create economic uncertainty. They create uncertainty on how people are going to live their daily lives. And the next one is usury, and I know this is not going to be popular for a lot of people. But debt is certainly one of the biggest problems that millennials and very likely the Zoomers coming up behind us are going to be dealing with. I'm 32 years old, so I'm a very old millennial. But the students I have in class are all Zoomers, and a lot of them are taking on debt, and there are certainly there are cases where people do pretty well with the debt that they have to incur. They go on to do very well in their jobs, and it really is a boon to them. Sometimes these situations are helpful for them to sort of get out of a situation where they wouldn't be able to afford any kind of college or, sort of advanced education. I have an article on usury on the Trad Dads page, so I don't want to say too much about this because it's a huge topic. But there is an article up there on usury that I think lays things out pretty well. And if it's not up there right now, it will be soon. Basically, the concept of usury is that a lender charges profitable interest and is allowed to recover damages from the borrower, regardless of whether or not there is collateral. So if a loan does not charge profitable interest, and it is collateralized, and the lender cannot seek restitution from the borrower himself, then the loan is not usurious. And there's a lot that goes into this about justifiable opportunity cost and things like that. But just suffice it to say, it's not about the level of the level of interest. Vix Prevent does a great job explaining this. It's not the level of interest rates that define usury. But so I've made the case, and maybe I'll just put a link. I know I published a different article on this, and so maybe I'll put that in the description as well if they'll let me. This one's on tradmag.org, former student of mine's page. If you just go tradmag.org, she has this article up there. But I will be republishing it. So I argue that a realistic ban on usury, so if we sort of find a way to step in this idea of banning sort of profitable interest on loans, obviously that would entail sort of getting rid of all credit cards. That would get rid of, all student loans would go away, car loans would go away. The only thing that would probably be left would be home loans, I would think, in terms of consumer loans. Home loans and sort of any kind of business loan would be fine under the rubric of usury, because the business itself is collateral, and the business itself justifies profitable interest because the business is generating profit. So, again, I don't want to go too far into that. But what I think would happen in sort of the equilibrium that would come about after we would get rid of usury is that the just loans that remained, in other words, the loans that were in conformity with justice, would likely have very high interest rates, because there would have to be some way of compensating for this very large risk that would be part of the transaction, now that the lender could not be compensated. And again, I'm thinking sort of short term here. I shouldn't say equilibrium maybe, but in the relatively short term here, because I think what would happen that would be a good thing is that, again, this is an example of policy affecting culture. I think what would happen would be people would see that they wouldn't have easy ways of digging themselves out of a problem. They wouldn't just say, well, if something happens, I'll just put it on a credit card. Well, when you do that, you get a credit card and then you run the thing up. Lots and lots of people do that. I've done it. And it's not good. And it's not fun. And I think what would happen is that would incentivize people to it would force them to go save their own money. It would force them to say, okay, look, I need to have a buffer. And that would be all to the good, because again, it's not just about the level of income. It's not just about the level of your standard of living. It's also about the variance of your standard of living. And again, this is nothing revolutionary. This is just sort of basic microeconomic theory, but just bringing in one more concept: variance, risk, to make these arguments. And I think it's totally sensible from an economic standpoint. And so that sort of being abrupt, this is sort of, I think there's a lot of wisdom in the social encyclicals, Rerum Novarum, Quadragesimo Annum, and again, I'll get some links to some of that stuff put in the description later if I can. I think Catholic social teaching, or sort of how the church sort of trades off between the sort of two Platonic ideals of capitalism and socialism, if you want to try to understand it that way. I think it helps us understand how to promote the common good, including protection of property rights, with sound economic policy analysis that treats the justice of the transactions very, very seriously. And it does not just let ethics and morality sort of sink all the way down to, well, whatever you choose is fine with, it's just fine. If you picked it, so you deal with the consequences. No, I think it's good for us as human beings to have some externally imposed constraints on our behavior before we see how bad the effects can be. And I think this is a point that a lot of commentators across the political spectrum, the illiberal political spectrum, bring up, is that that socialism is pretty pretty popular among Gen Z, the Zoomers. And, I think what we need to do, what I think the right wing needs to do, is to smartly articulate an economic way of thinking that is human-focused, that is more human-focused than liberal economics. And I think, as somebody who is a trained economist, this is something I really want to help contribute to. And I think, I want to work with philosophers and theologians in this space to make this case and make it in a way that people understand and that they see this as something sort of beneficial to them. And so with that, I do appreciate your attention. Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.